All right, people, we're back with yet another episode of Talking Thrones. This time we've got season 4, episode 7. Like I said, we're in the back half of the season. And like I said, continuing with what we said last week, banger every episode. Although, unlike last week's episode, which was kind of a little bit rear-loaded, this episode, Benioff Weiss, they do this every season. They always have one episode where they're just like, we're just going for it. Because, man, I forgot how good this episode was.
Dude, I totally agree. And let me tell you, the Talking TV family is going to be excited. Candace Everdeen is here. The Mockingjay, everything. Oh, wait, this is.
There we go. There we go.
Mockingbird. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I totally messed up on that one. But
I knew you had it in you.
At least a good episode of something. Yeah. Maybe not, Hunger Games.
Maybe not Hunger Games. Yeah, maybe a little bit time displaced there. But all of that and more with today's episode of Talking Thrones. You know, Pat, we have one of these episodes at least every season where we have, like, the big ones that we aim for, right? The ones that we know we're like, okay, we know we got a Reigns of Castamere. We know we got a Baelor. We know we got a Blackwater. We know we got Battle of the Bastards coming up. We know we got a Hardhome coming up. And occasionally we'll have those episodes where you're like, man, I was really looking forward to this episode, but only really for that one event. And then you remember the rest of the stuff in the episode is kind of whatever. But then you'll have the random ones, the random surprise that'll just come and you'll be like, wow. It was a way better episode than I remember it being. I remember what the one from season 2 was. It was A Man Without Honor in season 2, episode 7 of season 2. It was probably Second Sons last season. And then this season we had a couple, but oh man, I think that the award for episode that we were not expecting to be as great as it was and then surpass our expectations goes to this episode, Mockingbird, easily. I don't know. What's your take on that one?
The only thing that's on my mind, Dom, is what your thoughts are on if Jennifer Lawrence was cast as Marjorie in Game of Thrones.
Ooh, tricky. I gotta say no.
Because what other role would she be great for? I
don't know. Roz, maybe. Early. Nah, she would have already been too big and famous by that point because at that point she'd already won an Oscar. So because that's the thing people forget. Hunger Games is actually 10 years old this year, which is kind of wild when you think about it. But I don't know, man. There's a reason why they were so specific with the casting for this show.
Yeah, that's true. I can fantasy couch or cast this all I want. Oh, but hey, listen, this episode really very powerful with the writing. I think scene after scene after scene really just had these miniature micro stories to tell with our characters, and the fact is it just totally works the whole entire thing.
Yeah, Benioff and Weiss usually see this happen once we get into the second half of the seasons with some of the episodes that they write. Like I said, this is the first season since season 2, I think, where they were not majority writers on all of them. We had Brian Cogman writing 2 episodes. We had George R. R. Martin obviously contributing his last episode that he wrote for the show earlier in the season with The Lion and the Rose. We have another actual, a final thing that comes from this episode. This is the last episode directed by Alex Sakharov, who previously directed last week's episode, Laws of Gods and Men. He also directed The Climb for season 3 and What Is Dead May Never Die for season 2 is the last episode he directed. And I will say, too, that in addition to the writing, the directing for this episode is, I don't know why, there was something really, really striking about it. Just like the way the shots were composed, the way that he built tension with each scene, with like some scenes that were, again, very minimalistic, because the other thing that you usually see that happens with episodes like this that come in the second half where they don't really have a big episode. I mean, this episode being an exception because it does, but you'll see these episodes where they kind of are just setting you up for like the final couple of episodes, and they'll just, again, every scene just hits the way that it is, where they're able to mix like these events that don't seem really significant, but they're just so well done and well portrayed by the characters and the actors that they've been working with for about like roughly like 4 or 5 years at this point now. It's amazing. You have 3 conversations with Tyrion. It's like, wow, after the God tier monologue that he delivered at the end of last week's episode, you got his moment with Jaime, which is kind of like a nice like refresher, almost like making this like a, like a part 2 of last week's episode. Then you have his conversation with Bronn, and then you don't think, you're like, okay, they can't top that. And then they have the one with Oberyn at the end. You're like, oh my God, that's before we even get to like the big kind of moment that ends this episode,
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where we're starting, right? At least with one of these conversations between Jaime and Tyrion, right?
Yeah.
So listen, this is a talk amongst brothers, and the two of them are sort of, I would say disillusioned with the whole entire affair, right? So Tyrion's coming straight at Jaime. It's like, hey, listen, it's like, he even says like you're sleeping with your own sister, all this stuff to sort of jab at him. And Jaime reminds him, it's like, dude, I'm like your only friend right now. So I think the fact is, they're just really having at it. They're both dismayed, really at rock bottom at this point. And this is sort of the real conversation. Like, what are you going to do? You call for trial by combat. Clearly, you don't know what to do. Like, Tyrion can't fight it for himself. And so he does put out there like, hey, Jaime, this is your time to step up and, be a part of this trial.
Well, I think it's like the ultimate, like, kind of merging of everything that's kind of been built between the two of them throughout the season. We had to spend a little bit of time with each other in the first season before they kind of went off and diverged and went on their own journeys for the next couple of seasons. But this is really the first time that we've had them back together since season 1. And you've kind of been seeing this like kind of push-pull back and forth. Their love for each other, but also their kind of respective understanding of their positions in the family. And I feel like that's all like coming out and coming to a head right here, where Jaime's admonishing is like, you couldn't shut your mouth, do what you were told, and you would have lived. He's like, first of all, shutting my mouth and doing what I was told. A, that's not my style. B, what would it have gotten me? Okay, I'm freezing my ass off at the wall instead of like actually, walking out of this with my life. At least I'm walking out with my dignity. Also kind of calling Jaime out a little bit. It's like, look, you're the golden boy. You've never understood what it's like to be, the second child, for lack of a better word, the lesser one, which is something that, again, not to make this a little bit about me personally, but like, it gives you a little bit of a sort of peek into my life as well. Like, I could definitely relate to a few of those instances that Tyrion was talking about, but they're both kind of calling each other out. It's like, he's like, you're kind of an idiot for still believing that this would actually work. And Jaime's like, well, you're an idiot for not going along with the process with you. It's like, you had a way out and you shut the door right in its face, So they're both kind of like calling into question, but they're both kind of like understanding. They're both kind of, they're accepting their positions right now. Tyrion has always had to fight for everything that he's had, and Jaime kind of like, again, is comfortable in his stance while also trying to do what he can, but understanding that there's limitations to what he's able to do. And I just thought that was really, really well presented in that scene.
Yeah, and this scene, it serves as 100% like recapping what has happened up until this point, because most television shows, you basically want every episode to be as self-contained as possible. I understand, like, in the age of binging, you do have, like, cliffhangers, and then you sort of continue on and you try to get people to watch the next episode. But, like, still, a lot of it is self-contained. Like, if you basically just kind of walked into the room and your roommates or whatever were streaming something, hey, listen, you could pick up right there and then and understand the plot and continue. So that's what this scene really serves. The two of them are hashing what has just taken place, everything that led up to this moment for the most part. It's a nice little summary scene, and at the end of the day, it does progress their relationship forward, but it gives us a little bit of recap of what you might have missed in previous episodes. So I think it's brilliant in terms of just how it's executed in terms of the script. The second thing I will say is, Jaime points out that he couldn't even beat a stable boy, and that's what his training has proved him. Right. And it's like, damn, like Tyrion, what is he going to do? He's not going to do anything against anybody, really, because he's just outgunned, so to speak, in terms of the traditional fighting world that this is. And Jaime, he's mutilated. He doesn't have his left hand anymore. So he's sort of in the same boat now. The two of them are, believe it or not, on the same level, whether they believe it or not. So, or, realize it or not.
And the other thing, too, that I love about this episode is very similar to Sakharov's episode that he directed in season 3 of The Climb, right? Where he kind of like had all these other storylines that were kind of centered around like this one like kind of ascending thing, right? Where he kind of like builds it and uses that to like center tension, obviously where everything that happens in that episode is centered around Jon and the wildlings climbing up the wall. He does something kind of similar in this, where everything that happens in this episode is kind of centered around each of the conversations that Tyrion has while in the jail cell. Obviously, Jaime and Tyrion kind of kicks off the episode, then Jaime and then Bronn and Tyrion happens like right around the middle, and then obviously we have Oberyn and Tyrion kind of capping it before obviously the stuff at the Eyrie. And I just wanted to point out too that like the only scene that we have of Cersei in this episode that's also used like fantastic reintroduction to the Mountain. This is the third and final actor that we have playing the Mountain. He hasn't been on screen since, I think, like season 2. We have a new actor, but the final actor, you see, Hapthor, Julius Bjornsson, or as he's known, just Hapthor, 8 feet tall. He comes in. This guy doesn't need to act. He even knows. He's like, Cersei's like trying to throw all these niceties at him. He's just like randomly gutting all these random guys. It's just a great visual reintroduction of this character. What a force he is.
Yeah, listen, this is kind of comedic. Kind of violent. It's everything that you want in terms of making the Mountain such a vicious killer. Basically, it's I hate to say it, it's sort of like that old school, 90s professional wrestler Goldberg. It's like, who's next? And they're just running in there with weapons and getting disemboweled, and totally the Mountain's on a winning streak, and they're just kind of counting up his wins all the way up to like 100, 102, 100 whatever, right there in the middle of that courtyard. And it's Cersei's very confident that the Mountain is going to beat Tyrion or whoever he can find as his champion.
Well, and it's said in the next scene too, when Bronn comes to see him, it's like you're an idiot if you think that I'm actually going to fight the Mountain for you. Where Bronn comes in, and again, just this could have been so cut and dry, so easy. Comes in wearing this gorgeous looking silk. Is like, yeah, I'm not fighting for you. Your sister's basically paid me off. It could have been just that. Could have been just that. Then he just walked out. But the way that they build up to it, and the way that it kind of ends, because again, I'm also going to get into, once again, all the scenes that are in this episode of where they pull from the books and where they deviate a bit, because I think this episode, it's between this episode and the next couple where they probably like some of the last moments that are like directly pulled from Storm of Swords, but also like a couple of slight adjustments to them. But this scene is almost like beat for beat, word for word, exactly how it happens. I will say this scene is tarnished a little bit because obviously we still get Bronn for the next 4 seasons after this season, and to much, I think, more diminishing effect. But this scene is really powerful, and it's really, heartfelt, especially considering that this was a relationship that started off just based on money and advantation, and, all the way back in season 1 where we were still being introduced to these characters and kind of like getting to know them. And it kind of, I feel like, build up a point that you brought up last episode where when all of the people who are testifying against Tyrion bring up all those moments that we love, but they're kind of throwing it back at him, but also it's kind of throwing it back at us, the audience. You're kind of seeing that as well, where the whole time you're like, yeah, Tyrion's always going to have Bronn to fall back on. He's always going to be Tyrion's ride or die. And this is the moment that shows, no, that's not the case. Tyrion is just as susceptible and vulnerable, because unfortunately Cersei got to Bronn in a way that she was not able to through Pod. And unlike Pod, Bronn stands to benefit only tremendously by taking Cersei's offer to wed Lala Stokeworth rather than fighting the Mountain for Tyrion. And he again points out, it's like, yeah, you once told me that if anybody ever tried to buy me out from you, you would be able to double them. Well, this is the one instance where you can't, because you've got...
Well, and that's the greatest part about Tyrion's answer is like, well, what do you want? 2 wives or 2 castles? And Bronn's just like, well,
that's not the point.
I think it's definitely a fantastic scene because, Bronn at the end of the day, he knows he can't really defeat the Mountain, and it's not even worth him trying because he's a sellsword that came from nothing, and now he has this sort of like hand on the bottom of the ladder. He's able to climb into a little bit of wealth, and this pot has been sweetened. Basically, it's clear that you get to marry the younger daughter, and then the older daughter will accidentally meet some fate, and you'll inherit a castle.
And Tyrion more or less the anti-2, where it's like she's or Bronn is like Tyrion's like, she's still the heir and is older. And she's like, yeah, but she's 40 and barren. It's like, come on, guy.
Yeah, and like, people, have accidents all the time and they fall off their pretty horses,
exactly.
All that type of stuff. Like it's how it's kind of comes out in the conversation is really well written. And I think it's one of those things like, Tyrion says like, hey, have you forgotten the laws of inheritance? And that's when Bronn kind of confronts that a scheme is already in place for that to not really be an issue. And, it's Bronn is showing that he's playing the game, that he is the same person that he was beforehand, but obviously has learned from his time working with Tyrion, and that, here's a unwinnable challenge that Bronn could, for the sake of friendship, be a part of. But Bronn brings up the ultimate point. Like, when's the last time you risked your life for me? Yeah. And, that's ultimately the question. Throw their
friendship into it as well.
Exactly. So, like, Tyrion can't really ask him to risk his life on his behalf if he was never willing to risk it for Bronn.
Right.
And I think, that's part of the relationship. That was sort of the unspoken agreement that the two of them had, is that it was mutually beneficial. The two of them were sort of, of the same mind of, schemery. And I think it's one of those things where this is that inevitable path that you cannot go down. And so Bronn has to basically, whether he wants to really or not, he has to say, you know what, Tyrion, you're on your own.
Right. He's got to put his foot down. And I will say, too, again, like the goodbye that happens between them where it's like, it's like, I am sorry. It's like, why? It's like, you're just the same evil bastard that you were when I met you the first time. It's what I liked about you in the first place. But you can tell that even though they're trying to like cover it up with some like, some sort of like, notion of nostalgia, you can tell like this sucks for both of them because Tyrion knows that he's kind of lost one of the last allies he had. And Bronn, even though Bronn is a sellsword and a cutthroat, he knows this is tough for him, but he knows he has to look out for himself at the end of the day. But you can tell that he feels something because he gives him the double tap when he shakes his hand. He puts his hand on top of it, which I thought that was really touching. But I think it's actually really good that you pointed that out because what have you been saying since we started this podcast, Pat? What have you been saying since day one? If you don't play the Game of Thrones, you're gonna wind up dying, which is, I think, the perfect way to surmise how the scene between Tyrion and Oberyn at the end is the perfect thing to lead us into what happens to Oberyn in the next episode once we get to the inevitable Mountain of the Viper. It's the total opposite of Bronn. Bronn is operating completely from logic. Jaime, it's a little bit of 50-50. He's like, I would help you if I could, but also I don't have my hand, even though you're my brother, and it's the mountain, when he says so many words. Bronn is straight up logical. He's like, look, you are an idiot if you think that I'm going to fight that dude for you. And Oberyn straight up comes in, tells him this heartwarming story about how he saw him when he was a baby. He's like,
heartwarming. I don't think that's heartwarming.
Okay.
But
heartwarming is the wrong word. Heartwarming is the wrong word choice. But I think you know what I'm trying to say. He's trying to make Tyrion like kind of have this understanding that it's like, okay, you're not the only second son in the world. Whereas like I grew up, I heard, I went to Casterly Rock when I was younger. Your sister.
Well, it was all about like meeting him for the first time. Like, when Tyrion didn't know, he was just a baby. So how could he know anything? And Oberyn, he tells that great story about how as children, he was invited up to meet the new baby, the monster of Casterly Rock, which was Tyrion.
Right.
And for days, like Cersei basically promised to sneak them in and take a look at the child and, with the big head and the claw and all this other stuff that's, myths are made of. And ultimately, finally, the day happened when Cersei brought them in and Oberyn just sits there and is like, yeah, sure, his head's a little bit big, his limbs a little small, but like it's just a baby.
Yeah. And then Cersei drops the ultimate. Again, like this shows how much of a force of a menace that she still is, even in Tyrion's life. Where I feel like Cersei and Tywin are constantly in this battling out to like they're in this competition to see who can make Tyrion's life more miserable. And it's like 1 minute it's Tywin, and the next she's like, yeah, and she said it's like, yes, he is a monster. He killed my mother, and you could just see the look on Tyrion's face. It's like, oh my god, like can I not catch a break? And then he's like, well, he's like, well, Cersei's finally going to get what she wants. And he's like, well, what about what I want? He's like, I want justice. He's like, you may have come to the wrong place for that. He's like, I think I've come to the right place, And he's like, I will be your champion. And again, it's for all the wrong reasons. He's doing it again to avenge. Well,
it's for revenge, right?
Right, to revenge against his family honor and everything, but also it's a little bit of hubris involved too. He wants there's a reason why we saw the sequence with the Mountain taking out all those guys. It's because the Mountain has never really had a worthwhile adversary, and Oberyn fancies himself as that. So it's a little bit revenge, but it's also a little bit of hubris involved. And as we see in the next episode, not going to go well for him.
Well, it doesn't go well for anybody involved in this, but I think the fact is Oberyn, he's impatient. He's ready to go for it now, and he wants it now. And I think that's really what gets him. He's not willing to play the long scheme that the Lannisters, Tyrion, that the people that really are successful in this show are willing to do. Like, he kind of comes in this season. What is this, episode 7 so far?
Yeah.
So, he's introduced in like episode 1, and then here it is, 6 episodes later, he's ready to go straight for this duel. The moment has presented itself. So the show does a great job of like, you know, setting it up as like he is sort of vying for his moment, waiting for an opportunity. And this happens to be like a little bit sooner than he expected.
Right.
But ultimately, who knows what Oberyn's true aim is. Like he's blinded by revenge, and this might not be necessarily the right moment to step up and really enter a one-on-one combat with the Mountain. You know, I understand he wants to get it for revenge, but you know, is that really what everyone else is doing? You got Joffrey who's poisoned.
Yep.
You got, you know, Catelyn and Robb Stark. They're sort of betrayed at the wedding and, you know, attacked from behind more or less. It's one of those things where like basically having the characters in this world dead to rights is really what wins you the day.
Right.
And Oberyn is just going to waltz in, open combat, and then just have his revenge.
Right.
You know, it's like, come on.
It's a little one of those too good to be true scenarios.
Exactly.
That Martin loves setting up.
It's really not going to go his way. You know, spoiler alert, you know, and it's one of those things where, you know, in this world, it's just ill-advised to be so brazen. But, you know, obviously Oberyn is that confidence, you know, has confidence, I mean, in his abilities. And he really has that focus, that anger, that need for revenge, that he's going to do it. Like he's a true believer of what he is capable of. And he's just going straight for it. And, you know, that makes for great television. Who knows if it makes for a great personal strategy. Well,
we will see next episode, obviously. We'll talk more about it next episode. But it's definitely, to me, an instance of screaming where it's like, this is not setting itself up to be too well. And again, to bring it back to the books, I still cannot get over between the Red Wedding and the end of A Storm of Swords, they had Joffrey's death, Tyrion's trial, the Mountain of the Viper, the Battle of the Wall, all within. I'm done gushing about how well they adapted because it's still never ceases to amaze me. So we got a couple more scenes to cut to before we get to kind of the big ending, set piece of this episode and kind of the big revelation. So Castle Black, we check in quick with them. The Night's Watch members return. They're greeted, by the rest of their brothers. They had a successful, and of course Thorne is already back to cause trouble. He's like, Jon, lock your direwolf in the cages or I'll have Hobb kill it. And Jon's just like, come on, man, I cannot get a break. But after,
well, dire wolves too, right? The guys at Castle Black could probably enjoy some extra
probably
meaties too.
Fed for a while, but so they recap. They're like, so even we had this little detour with the with the wildlings with taking care of the mutineers 2 episodes ago, but it's like we got to refocus again. Mance is on his way here. We saw their fires. They'll be here before the full moon. Once again, Jon butting heads with Ser Alliser as far as what's best to do here, where it's really interesting kind of looking back on this in hindsight, because even though Ser Alliser is still letting his hatred of Jon overpower any other rational-minded decision, at the end of the day, I think the interesting thing that's established here between the two of them throughout the course of this season, at least, before we get to the next two, obviously, up until Ser Alliser's death, is that they're both still fighting for the same thing. They both want what's best for the Wall and for the Night's Watch. They cannot get past their hatred for each other, which is where obviously going all the way back to season 1, Ser Alliser thinks that Jon is way too privileged, having grown up in a castle, and now deeming himself versus Ser Alliser was probably more so, grew up a low-born commoner, probably had to work for his way of everything, and he probably sees Jon still as this spoiled highborn lord, versus Jon, always been an outsider, feels like he never got respect, even in his own family, just kind of come here looking for his calling, and here's this guy who just will not give him a break at all, simply for the fact that he grew up, slightly more better off than him, and it really sucks because I feel like it's one of those scenarios of relationships where if the two could just get past their butt-headed natures, they could really do some good, but they just cannot. Where Ser Alliser is refuting every point that Jon brings up, to the point where he's even willing to endanger the rest of the Night's Watch when he brings up the idea that's like, we should seal the tunnel, and because they're not going to stop the giants.
So Dom, I think this is a great moment because it's essentially Jon makes this point, we got to seal the tunnels. I've seen the giants. Oh, there's like 4 feet of, steel. And it's like, no, it doesn't matter. Giants are giants. They're going to come through that and they're going to attack us. They're going to get us. And the fact is we need to flood the tunnels. We need to freeze them over. We need to stop them completely. And it's like, well, how are we going to range north? Well, we're not. because we need to defend the wall at all costs.
They should have brought up, and I don't know, because again, Jon can really not bring up anything to Alliser without him refuting it with something that's based purely on his hatred for her, which is like, yeah, okay, so forget the wildlings, but we still have the White Walkers. Now, it's really interesting, obviously, this decision in hindsight, because seeing this decision in hindsight, because right now, Jon is only thinking about the pending wildling attack, but obviously once they survive the war, he actually realizes the decision Ser Alliser may have been right as far as, keeping the wall unplugged, as far as bringing the rest of the wildlings south rather than leaving them north to be, meat for the White Walker army. I just find it really interesting that they're not, that Jon's not thinking about that in long term now. But I guess in the sense of like they only have this wildling threat to deal with right now.
Well, here's the thing that's weird about it is like if they did freeze all the tunnels and prevent the wildlings from coming in, would the wildlings really have the ability to, blow a hole in the wall or something to really allow the White Walkers to follow them through?
True.
We'll
get into that once we get into the cockamamie of the last two seasons.
Yeah, in the course of the show, they never really set up how the White Walkers are going to get past the wall. Right. So, ultimately it ends up being one of Daenerys' dragons, gets turned on dead, and that's what blasts through the wall.
Right.
But in essence of like knowing the whole entire series, they could have just flooded the tunnels and called it a day. They would never have had to deal with the White Walkers.
Right.
So it's very interesting to sort of see how the show progresses after this point and realize like, well, Jon was completely right. They could have just kind of, froze those tunnels, kept the wildlings over there, give them to the Army of the Dead, and the Army of the Dead would just sort of like hang out, never able to get past the wall. Obviously something probably would have came up, but like in storytelling, it wasn't inevitable how the White Walkers were going to get past that wall.
Right. And obviously, if we're going based off the comparison to the books, obviously, the hints being that the horn, because obviously, they reference it a couple times in the show, but they never really explicitly state that it's the horn of Jorah, where in the books, Ygritte informs Jon they're under this notion that Mantis found this ancient horn called the Horn of Jorah, which is this horn that supposedly, when it's blown, would wake up the giants and allow them to tear down the wall. I don't think exactly how that would work specifically, but in the books, Melisandre burns this horn, but it's also strongly, once Stannis and them, defeat the wildlings and they capture Mantis, the wildlings, it's strongly hinted that, however, this is not the real horn, and that the real horn is being held somewhere in Old Town, which is famously where Euron Greyjoy is going to invade in the books, because in the books, it's being strongly set up that Euron is going to either form some sort of alliance or potentially take over the White Walkers as the new Night King. I don't know. Well, I'll save that for a later day once I bring on Eli onto the podcast and he can break it down, because he's dove into every theory as far as where the books are going to go, and some really potentially interesting routes that they could go. But that's essentially like kind of what it seemed like they were setting up for in the books. And obviously we see that the show goes in a drastically different direction there. But
no, 100%. And listen, we went off on a tangent, and it's definitely my fault, but to end what happens at basically north at the wall, we basically just have to say that it's like Alliser takes the moment to say, hey, you're a Stewart.
Yeah.
And who's responsible for the who's responsible for the tunnels?
I love the look that Bowen Marsh gives him too, where he's like, he's like, current leader, could be potential future leader, and like you just see the look on his face.
That's when he says the builders are in charge, and he's like, Chief Builder, do you agree with this assessment? And it's the politics that basically leads him to say no. Right. So Jon is sort of dismissed at this point and deflated, and essentially they're going to move forward with just defending themselves by 4 feet of steel or whatever the measure is. Right. And that's it. They're not going to listen to Jon. They're going to kind of continue forward with what they've always done. And, hey, we'll see. We'll see what happens in the next couple episodes.
Indeed, we shall. Also, we do quick check-in with Dragonstone. Obviously, this is the last time that we check in with this storyline before, we see them again in the finale. Things are pretty much wrapping up on Dragonstone. They're beginning their march, their expedition north to the wall. Stannis and Davos have sailed back from.
This is the scene where Melisandre asks for some bubbles for her bath, and so what is it, Selyse?
Selyse, yeah, just
almost hands her both poison.
Yeah, every single scene is literally just like Melisandre just showing off her form, but it's like, we get it, Karis Van Houten, you're gorgeous. You don't need to flaunt it every single chance. We get it.
It's a very short scene, and it's basically just a strange excuse to or whatever.
Or
it's
more Lord of Light jargon, whatever. It's basically
pretty blunt excuse to get her into the bubble bath.
But also
whatever.
it's there to set up the fact that Shireen needs to come to the wall because this is what they're building toward. And again, like if this is the point where they started etching out the idea for Stannis' ultimate defeat next season, we'll get to that when we cover it in season 5 because there's so many. For as much things I love that they changed and added from the books in season 4. Season 5 to me is where it all goes out the window and starts to go downhill. Like I'm still not a fan of a lot of the changes that they made, mostly because I just don't feel like that they add any benefit to the story. But this scene, the way the results, like, oh yeah, Shireen's gonna come north with us, whatever the case may be. The Lord of Light's got a mission for her, and I'm just in hindsight, I'm like, oh, so that's what this scene is for. Okay, it's another one of those things that they're just like, okay, we have this super cool, crazy thing coming later on, but we have this one scene that we got to throw in. It gets by the fact that it's incredibly well written. The way that the same as the rest of the scenes are in this episode, but this is the one scene where
100%. I think most of the characters are represented in this episode. They have like moments that sort of move their stories ahead. They're well written for the most part, and listen, I'm joking because it literally is just sort of a casual bath scene, but like. It's I don't know what there is to say. Much more to say about it.
Like, she takes a bath, some bubbles, and then she's
here's the poisons, and let me explain one of them to you. I guess I totally forgot by now which one what she was explaining.
You know what's so confusing about this scene to me is the fact that obviously Selyse we know is like so devout to the Lord of Light. She's all about that. She openly admonishes her daughter. She's super cool with the fact that, Melisandre, I think she figures out pretty quick. She starts dropping the hints last season in season 3 about Melisandre potentially sacrificing Shireen, saying that she's impure and all that. And obviously until like the final breaking up point when, the deed is actually done. But the crazy thing is that she doesn't want Shireen to come north with them. So I find that really interesting where this is a mother who has been super harsh and not at all really like motherly towards her daughter, potentially for whatever, potentially for some form of mental instability, potentially for losing all of her sons. She did show that she keeps all of their sons in jars, which is really weird, but in a strange way, like showing some sympathy and caring for her daughter. I don't know. It's just like I said, it's really one of those moments. It's really, really strange in hindsight, but also it's like, it's one of those things that makes me question, like, were the seeds there then, or was it just kind of a thing of where it's like, okay, they're just directing you in the moment and we're not really sure where this is going to go. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't know how well thought out this was ahead of time, and it kind of makes the scene worse in hindsight, unfortunately.
No, I kind of go to the fact that they wrote this scene. It's for the moment. It really what it is in future episodes, if it seems like they planted a seed, they were able to sort of look back at what they did and then kind of mold it to the way they want to be. Like, I would truly believe that. I don't think they would have like sort of this, whole entire series planned out where every single time they make a scene, it's for a reason. I think they just really know their characters. They write good scenes, and they always leave themselves the ability to build upon what they've done in the past. And so I think it's just really they leave themselves open-ended enough to really pivot and make those moves properly. Yes. I don't know. There's not much more to say about Dragonstone. It's kind of like a simmer on the back burner.
Yep.
I think really where it's popping and where I would like to take this conversation next is Meereen.
Oh, Meereen. Okay.
You want to do the Riverlands, but
no.
I'll
do Meereen. No, Meereen works because Meereen actually happens next. I was going to switch that anyways, but yeah, Meereen, great scene. Great fucking scene. I'm sorry. I know I've been trying to pull back on the F-bombs, but hey, Dany and Daario finally get it on. Like, they have been building this all season, ever since they recast Ed Skrein with Michelle Huisman, and man, things are simmering in Meereen right now.
Yeah, well, Daenerys is really going to take advantage of Daario and his basically assets, I guess. So the main thing is
his devotion to her.
100%. And here's the thing: is like it's something where she's the queen, and she basically gets what she wants. And I think at this moment, it's like, well, why not? Daario is this sort of manservant that I can control, and she's totally into using him for every whim that she needs, and that includes the self-pleasure, so to speak, or just pleasure in general.
Even Queen's got to get one off.
Yeah, so with all that said and done, it's like the scene that I found very interesting is when Jorah comes in and sort of asks her about, hey, what's going on? Like, you can't really trust Daario and all this stuff, and she makes it clear that to at least Jorah that hey, listen, it's like, I don't really trust him, but like I'm going to use him how I see fit, and this is my plan. And Jorah, doesn't like the fact that, they're going back to Yunkai to kill the masters, because it's like, the slaves have only known brutality. And if you continue showing them brutality, that's all they're going to ever know. And so you got to change things up. You got to, blah, 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 and, rule differently. Right. So like he kind of goes on and has a good point. But, he wins her over, and she's basically says, hey, I forgot the guy, the son of the one master.
Oh, he's Darzol Lorak. Yeah.
Yeah. So she's going to send him with Daario, and, he can make the appeal to the other masters. Like, hey, this is what's going to happen. You're either going to get slaughtered, or you can live under, Daenerys's new rule. And that's a better chance than they were going to get if Jorah didn't actually speak to her.
For sure. And like the one thing I will say is, again, like this scene like kind of is showing that like where Jorah again has been largely on the back burner since really last season, and kind of to reemphasize Jorah's importance to her, obviously before the inevitable reveal that we get next episode. But I think for me, the bigger takeaway from this scene, much more so than anything going on with Jorah and Daario, which again, I feel like Jorah's in a competition to see like what more like, disgusted and ultimately like dismayed at Daario, like the face that he makes last season when Dany immediately asks how Daario is after they take Yunkai for her, or the face that he makes this episode where he walks in and sees Daario walking out with his shirt unbuttoned. It's like both facial expressions are absolutely priceless. But the one thing that I will say is for me, how even though Dany is still taking Jorah's advice, and rightfully so, where Jorah still is advising her probably the best and the smartest, where she's like, how do I excuse evil men? And she's like, I was a slaver, and if Ned Stark had done what you did, I wouldn't be here. So what you wanted to do to the masters, I wouldn't be here serving you. But she's still very black and white. She's still very, it's like, okay, I'm going to send people that speak more so your language, but you're still going to do what I say or die. And there's still really that very black and white, very harsh left, far right or far left. There's really no middle ground, no compromise. And that right there is, I'm like, okay, you can coat it in sugar all you want, but you're still kind of offering them the same choice that they had before. So that to me was the much bigger takeaway, where it's like, okay, this season, this is the season where she's kind of out of her conquest phase and fully into her ruling phase. The seeds are really being laid here for the Mad Queen to start, before obviously we get into the next couple seasons with the Sons of the Harpy and everything going on with them. So just more interesting observations that I made kind of going forward. Then we cut to the Riverlands, and oh man, this stuff to me is like the meat and potatoes of this episode before we get into the final scene. Like, I love everything that's happening here.
Listen, it's basically, let's save the stories of the two sisters, the two Stark sisters, for the end of this recap, because man, these sequences are amazing. So basically Arya and the Hound just traveling around. This is the buddy cop of the season, storyline. The two of them just getting to know each other, two different backgrounds. They don't know if they can trust each other. And this is the moment where, we find out that, she's learning. She's not just, Arya is not just some random, young woman that doesn't know anything. She, our young girl, I should say, she's, becoming and progressing and becoming a young woman, specifically trained in, warfare and
and combat and understanding like the means of just human life and death, unfortunately. And I think it's perfectly captured in that scene where they go and see that farmer with one of the I'd say like one of the best written scenes on this entire show, where they just see this poor farmer whose farm has been completely ransacked.
I totally forgot about this scene. I to be honest with you, I was watching this, and this was like just pure gold. I actually, went into the browser and pulled the scene back and watched it a second time, just because like it was well written, it was well acted, like everything about it was perfection.
And I'll tell you, too, what else like made the scene ring true for me, besides just the brilliant writing and the performances, is kind of what it meant, where we're kind of wrapping up this phase of the storyline. Obviously, we had the scene a couple episodes ago with the farmer where the farmer tried to hire the Hound, and the Hound ended up just robbing him and taking his gold and leaving. And he's like, yeah, they'll be dead by nightfall. And you could see it's like it's this thing that ultimately so frequently happens in real life, which is, again, the higher-ups, the lower class and the middle class get ultimately destroyed, and their lives completely upended by the higher ups. And once the higher ups are done, they kind of just go back to doing what they do. When you have all of these people that are kind of just left stuck to fend with the consequences. And that's kind of what this guy is saying, where it's just like, things used to be fair, things used to be honest trade. Now who even knows what that is, and it's ultimately sad and kind of unfulfilled. Where we started this season with Arya and the Hound as they were kind of trekking across, the wreckage of the Stark Lannister war, and we have these little brief moments to kind of clue you in and see, these are the people who are really affected by this conflict. Not any of these high lords, not any of these characters, and the fact that you have these characters like Arya and the Hound, and they're the ones that are kind of, seeing them and kind of like checking us in and cluing us in as to how things really work. It's masterfully done. This is the stuff these are the moments to me where Benioff and Weiss truly, truly do shine. And it's the fact that we get away from these moments that I think are also a large contributor as to why the last couple seasons do not work as well as these first couple.
Yeah. Hey, listen, like, my favorite line that the farmer says is, "Do you have some water? Dying is hard work." Yeah, thirsty work. Oh man, just
then he's like, "I wish it was wine," and the Hound's like, "Me too." Before he stabs him.
Like every line is like built in there. It's like, hey, it's like, what happened here? Oh, the robbers came. They stabbed me. It's like, well, what are you doing? Like, oh, he just kind of brushes them. He completes their sentence. He's like, oh, I've thought about it. It's just like, well, why are you fighting death? Like, why are you staying alive? And he's like, probably out of habit. It's just like living's kind of good. Like he's just. It's very like it's problematic of this guy,
right? But it's true to real life. It's resounding. Like how many people in our lives that we know of and both don't know of that are probably in this exact same scenario where it's like, yeah, it's just a habit at this point, and that stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's the stuff that rings true. That's the stuff to me that really makes this show special. Unfortunately, it's upended by an almost farcical like attack sequence where we get the two morons from season 2 who were locked in the cage with Jack and come back. The one bites the Hound's neck off. The Hound somehow pulls a wrestling move, like snaps his neck while he's flipping him over.
Oh yeah. Well, you jumped ahead because like the Hound does have mercy on this guy and stabs him in the heart, and that's when the guy jumps on his back.
Right.
And he does basically one of the meanest stone cold stunners I've ever seen that just snaps his neck.
I knew you would know the move.
No, hey, listen, it's 90s pop culture. So, basically he's bitten. The Hound turns around and he's like, what the hell? And then he sees the other guy and it's like, dude, like, why would you make this decision? You just thought you would come across the two of us. And the guy explains, like, you're the Hound, it's like we're gonna,
we're
make
gonna get like the bounty on you. And he's like, I guess that's what happens when you say to F the king. And he's like, the king's dead. He's like, I'm just collecting the bounty on you. This bounty is for killing the Lannister soldiers. And they're like, oh man. And then Arya ends up killing him in a great sequence where he's like, is he on your stupid? Because Arya recognizes him and he's like, is he on your stupid list? And he's like, no, I don't know his name. And then he gets his name and she's like, thank you. Then she stabs him. Great scene, like a great kind of like
everything about it
is masterful. Right. Then we have the next scene with them where they're sitting down, and they have a great little heart to heart right there. It's absolutely masterful. Where she's offering to help him, and she's like, no fire, and he like kind of like really opens up to her, and he's just like, look, your brother made you that sword. And he's like, well, my brother gave me this. He's like, and he kind of like explains it. He's just like, he's like, yeah, you pushed me to the fire. It wasn't even the fire that hurt, or the what's it called, or the pain or the smell. He's like, it was just the fact that it was my brother.
Well, he said the pain was awful, but not, it was what it was. The smell was worse. And the thing that really hurt was that it was his brother who did it.
Right.
And he goes on to tell this whole story about how his father defended the mountain, his older brother, and how he just lied to everybody about the hound's bedding catching on fire. And that's the reason why he's scarred and all this stuff. And, you know, it really, he brings up the point like, hey, Arya, like, you know, you felt like you've been isolated, like you've been alone. Like, try my life.
Yeah.
You know, like he is actually has, you know, really the bottom of the barrel in terms of family. And, you know, just like, you know, he's had to endure. He's basically hardened because of that. And, you know, look at the type of man he is. And that's what this little journey's about, is kind of like Arya as this sort of, young sort of lord, you know, or at least daughter of a lord. And it's about her preconceptions about humanity. And, you know, it's like she wants to be a warrior. And, well, you know, he knows that it takes a certain coldness, a certain cruelty, you know, a certain cutthroatness. And, you know, this is where he's able to sort of, you know, over the course of this journey, basically paint the picture of what it will take Arya to get to the point where she could be a warrior just like him,
right?
Just like Ned Stark,
right? All the good and the bad that comes with that.
Yeah, exactly. Just with like any of the other knights that are in the realm, if this is the path you want to go on, there is a certain, cruelty that you will have to endure and basically just face it. Like you have to accept it, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. It shows that, like, again, she kind of grew up in a strange way, again, having the same aspirations of as Sansa, but for the opposite, you know, of being a knight, being a warrior, defending the innocent, protecting those, who can't defend themselves. And as she's getting older and she's spending all this time out there in the wilderness, you know, with the commoners, so she's learning like what being a warrior, you know, actually means. And she's realizing it's probably a lot more isolating and a lot more lonely and a lot more just harsh than like she probably ever realized beforehand as she spends this time with the Hound. The flip side of that coin, however, is Brienne, where we check in briefly with this episode. And this is another sequence where it's similar in isolation in of itself. It's another incredible sequence. But I have a slight problem with it, both based off where it goes with Brienne, specifically with the next season, and also kind of where it goes in the books, which is where, so obviously we have this brief check-in with Brienne and Podrick. They're eating at this inn. This, ironically enough, again, just a matter of convenience, the same inn where Hot Pie is. You know, they run into Hot Pie. Hot Pie sits down with them after they compliment the kidney pie.
Yeah, the kidney pie. Oh, my God.
Kidney pie. It's great. They go back outside, and Pod is like lecturing her. She's like, you know, the Lannisters kind of control this territory. We probably shouldn't be like just asking openly about Sansa. And Hot Pie comes out and kind of clues them in as to everything that's going on. She's like, you know, with Arya and where they went, they're kind of able to piece everything together. They're like, oh, okay. So
yeah, well, the thing that I think is the thing that's awesome about this scene is Hot Pie hands over another baked good,
yes,
and says, "Hey, you know, it turned out better this time. Can you make sure Arya gets it?" And Brienne just unfolds it, and it's, you know, a dire wolf bread once again, and it looks perfect. And, you know, I think that's, you know, really heartwarming with this sequence is that, Hot Pie, even though he's found a life for himself, it might be kind of a hard life, but he will, you know, survive. He'll have a place. He basically still, thinks of his friend, that's out there that's still, going down this path, who has a longer journey than he did to get where she belongs. And, it's definitely on that end heartwarming, but it's also like open-ended because, Podrick has said like, hey, we shouldn't really be talking to people. Right. We shouldn't really be open about this. It's serendipitous, right? Brienne has, really gotten some information just by being so blunt, doing something that, Podrick's right about. She shouldn't be saying that.
Right.
But because, she didn't think about it and because she just sort of blurted it out there, this really good serendipitous happenstance moment came about and really gives them something to really enjoy, about their journey. It's like
the scene is kind of the flip of the Arya Hound sequence that we were just talking about, where the Arya Hound sequence is all about how, kind of being a warrior is kind of lonely and isolating and harsh, and you kind of have to look out for and defend for really yourself first and foremost just to survive. Whereas we have Brienne, she's wearing the fancy armor. She's, acting like, she's presenting herself like a knight. She's kind of like, being inspiring to all the commoners. And she's finding that she's getting exactly what she wants by being truthful and being honest and everything. So so that parallel there is really interesting. And of course, the hot pies, the kind of the wholesome moment at the end is really, really touching. Here's where I have a problem with it, though. And I'll jump to this in a little bit. Where, once we get into season 5 and like I said, and once I start to cover like how season 5 deviates from the books and why I think that it's detrimental, not necessarily to the direction the show was going in, but just to kind of the story and everything that Martin had kind of intended originally. So in the books, there are never any counters that Brienne has with Hot Pie or anything like with anybody that remotely knows everything. It's only like random rumors and whispers and everything. She doesn't really know where she's going. They end up like kind of south towards Maidenpool and the Stormlands. They end up running into, Randall, Tarly, Sam's dad. And the whole thing is that Brienne is never anywhere near any of the Stark girls, right? Like never once. And it's been made perfectly clear that she never really has any shot of, any shot of finding them. Both A, because she's being misled by every person, and B, because she's in completely geographically the wrong area. She ends up going south instead of north like she does in the show. The other reason being because they kind of are already starting this off in season 4 versus a lot of the other storylines. They had at least wrap up a Storm of Swords before they shifted to season 5, which is where this is the first major deviation where in the books, they're setting up Brienne to kind of engineer like a reunion between Jaime and Lady Stoneheart, who is the resurrected Catelyn Stark in the books that they chose to completely omit and cut from the show. Versus in the books, they very clearly are still intending Brienne towards her destination of, maintaining her oath, maintaining her vow, and ultimately finding both Stark girls, failing at first, but then kind of succeeding in the long run. And I guess my problem comes from the fact that in hindsight, as far as the show, it's so sloppily done with kind of her meeting up with Sansa. And then Sansa's like, oh no, I don't trust you. And then the whole her waiting for Sansa to light a candle, and then her coming out of nowhere and saving Sansa, and then her leaving. It's just, I have a lot of problems with where they take Brienne over the course of the next 2 seasons, that the fact that kind of we have all these pieces just kind of conveniently falling into place for her. I don't know. It's one of those things that definitely in hindsight is kind of marred what should be like a really well-written moment, and I think like a really touching, heartfelt moment in this episode,
I think what happens here in season 4, I think they do take it in a decent direction. I think your qualms with what happens to Brienne later is really they just don't know what to do with that character. They don't know where to fit her in to the world. And to your point about the books is, they definitely took her in a different direction.
Yes, 100%.
When they decided, they probably after this season was done, season 5, that's when they sort of were deciding whether or not they wanted to have Lady Stoneheart in it, because it could have been a surprise. Hey, because we brought her back.
Because the whole thing is that, at least for me, if we're still following this point in the books, the Storm of Swords, the ideal point would be to end the season not with Arya going off, but with the scene at the end of Lady Stoneheart and the Brotherhood hanging more Fremen. That would have been the way to end this season. And when they didn't do that, and I'm like, okay, they could potentially say that as opening for next season. But then when they didn't do that,
for me, I think it would have been the perfect opening for season 5 because you would have basically just Michael Myered it. Exactly. Every Halloween movie, they basically just retcon their previous movie pretty much and show how he survived. Right, so they could have done that at the beginning of the season, and you would have been like, oh man, this season's getting
absolutely
heated right off the bat.
The other purpose that the Lady Stoneheart character to me serves in the books is that by that point, kind of the transition, the jumping up between season 4 and 5, and also kind of the jumping up between book 3 and then obviously book 4 and 5, because those 2 books take place at the same time. Is the Lady Stoneheart character to me is kind of what I think is another problem that I have with the last couple seasons of the show, which is where the show is and the story is ultimately supposed to get more supernatural, but to the point not just with North of the Wall, where we've had the hints of the Walkers, but it's where the supernatural is supposed to start to kind of ink its way into all of the different storylines, between Lady Stoneheart and the Riverlands, Euron and his conquests in, towards Old Town and everything. There's hints, obviously, at potentially something more supernatural happening with the other Greyjoy brother that's not at all included in the show, Victarion, as he's on his way to Daenerys in the books, There's and obviously everything that's going north of the wall, but there's even crazier stuff going on north of the wall than what we see. And so the So the decision by Benioff and Weiss to really not incorporate any of those supernatural elements really until like the last 2 seasons is it's really confusing and muddling, essentially to the point where it's like, okay, they were supposed to kind of get more so into this range of, of prophecy and of mysticism and everything, and kind of get even more deconstructive with that. And the fact that they chose to keep it in this like kind of pseudo medieval realm while at the same time continuing with the politics game, but also just upping the spectacle to like crazy amounts like that's another kind of thing that we'll get into obviously once we get into the last season. But let's wrap this episode up with.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing to your point is, from the fact that you're one of the readers of the books and you really enjoy the books a lot, you're entering that territory of, being more in love with the book's version of the storyline,
of course,
than treating these television shows separately. So
for sure.
I do want to say, like, it's great to hear the comparison. I like to, understand what I'm missing as being a non-book reader. I just watched the show. I enjoyed the show. And there's that. I know about, the whole Lady Stoneheart storyline because I stumbled upon it on like a Wikipedia page or something like that, and I was just like, whoa, what am I missing from the books?
It gets
and so
nuts.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like expecting a lot of that stuff to, I didn't want to spoil myself, so I only went so far, and I kind of waited for it to show up in the TV show, and it never really did. And I was okay with that because it's something I could have, gone, read all the books and kind of enjoyed this additional storylines. I think really what they were focusing on is keeping this show broadly appealing enough for the massive audience that they had. I think they were successful in that. And, I can't really blame them for not taking the show into what could have potentially been more confusing because as the show went on, right, we got shorter and shorter seasons, everything was really compact and, redesigned for like binging television later in the last couple seasons.
For sure.
So if you had more of those sort of magical elements, it would have been a lot more loose ends to tie up, and storylines could have been a little less concise. And things could have gotten a lot more muddled than they ultimately did in the way that the show sort of ends. And so they have to kind of choose their battles, and I think they really focus on what made the show popular, which is just all the backstabbing, all the sort of scheming and whatnot, and basically only allowed a certain amount of the magic to really permeate this world.
For sure. And I get where you're coming from in that sense, but there's really only 2 points that I have to bring up in order to potentially counter that. One, just, obviously, the last 2 seasons speak for themselves as far as, okay, so they kept the show grounded, but then, we still got the last 2 seasons and we saw that was their conclusion of the story. And it's like, okay, so that kind of spoke for itself. And the other point is, kind of just the fact that, as far as like kind of them, breaking more so into the binge mode model as far as that goes. It like I said, that's kind of that's something that was ultimately just out of the show's control for. Like I said, the show happened literally on the precipice between like kind of what I call the peak prestige TV era versus the streaming era. And so as a result of them kind of like having to compact it, I guess my only problem with it is the fact that the books also at that point, even though they start to introduce more of the supernatural and magical elements, they don't lose sight of the backstabbing. If anything, the backstabbing gets crazier as time goes on, and it's almost like they wanted to get away from that, which is kind of interesting. But like I said, we'll save that for a later date. We'll save that for like once we get into seasons 5 and 6 and more of the discussion. But
I'm ready to ask you a new question, Dom.
Yes,
so let's move on to this. And
ask away.
Does Winterfell have a moon door?
I don't think so. Winterfell's not built into the side of a cliff. So.
Oh, really? Well, can I add a moon door just willy nilly?
I don't think so. I don't think that's how Winterfell was kind of constructed over thousands of years ago. I don't think that's how the architects would have originally intended for it. Also, I don't know how that would have even worked logistically. Like, oh, what? You just jump out the door and into the dirt?
It could have been like
up into the Godswood, like it goes through a portal and I shine. Like, what are we talking about here?
I'm thinking a hole in the ground with some spikes at the bottom, right? That would probably work.
That's not bad. That's not bad. I don't know if it would have the same impact though.
Yeah, just cut to Sansa hanging out in a snowy courtyard, rebuilds Winterfell in the snow, and then
damn good job too of it.
Oh yeah, and she's so humble. It's like, oh, this is what I remember of it. I don't really know if I got it right.
And it comes
oh man.
And then comes this little shit to just flex it. It's like, you want to build a snowman? We're gonna do exactly what you want. And she's like, look, you asshole. Like, what are you doing? And she slaps him. Like, she probably gives the kid the first amount of discipline that he's ever had in his entire life.
Listen, Robin, like, is such a great character in this show. it's just the how like miserable of a young man this character is supposed to be, and just the performance that's given time and time again. Like you just feel this anger towards this character.
You're right, and it's so awesome. It's almost like you're channeling like the Tyrion Joffrey slap right into that slap again. You're just like so satisfied. You're like yes.
Sansa
about the show and making such little shithead characters like that.
Yeah, so Robin basically just goes in. He's like, I'm going to make a moon door, and he knocks over half of Winterfell. And Sansa's like, what are you doing? I'll have to start over. And then it's like, what do you mean what I'm doing? I was just making it better, if anything. And it's like, Sansa just looks at him straight in the face, dead-eye, deadpan. You're being an idiot.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like no one's ever told him that, because he's been coddled his whole entire life. And, you know, he continues to throw a tantrum just like Joffrey would. And boom, Sansa just goes crazy and, you know, does a Tyrion to Robin, you know, his face, and slaps him. And, you know, it's one of those things where Littlefinger kind of slowly creeps in from the shadows and says,
does he know any other way to enter a room at this point? I feel like he's been doing that for so long. I don't think he knows how to do anything, how to enter a room any other way.
And it's like almost the slow clap, like Littlefinger from...
Oh, it's great.
You know, whatever.
Awesome. It's
almost that scene if they really had gone for it.
Yeah.
But the fact is,
missed opportunity,
you know,
there.
Littlefinger basically just says, hey, you know, he probably has deserved discipline for years, but has never gotten it. This is probably going to be a good thing for him. Oh, but what if Lysa finds out? And, you know, Sansa's just really nervous about Robin telling her aunt, because Lysa has already like declared her hatred for Sansa. So I think this is a very interesting sequence, because at the end of the day, Littlefinger is like a little bit in seduction mode and trying to, you know, really, you know, just sort of grow the connection between Sansa and himself.
Right.
And at the same time, Lysa's in the background, sort of looking down in the courtyard, and sees when Littlefinger goes in for a kiss.
Well, so this is a really interesting point, I think, both in the books and in the show, because again, unlike a lot of the couple previous storylines we were talking about, they absolutely nailed like every single sequence as far as like how they built this up for the translation for the books of the show, like completely perfectly adapted. And so what's interesting to me about this sequence and kind of where they take it from here on out, in the moment, it's brilliant because it's ultimately showing, you know, kind of Littlefinger showing his hand. Like, even though we already knew, because so that's a brilliant thing to me about Littlefinger's arc kind of throughout this whole season, is that it's the showing of both his motivation and him showing his hand, where we get, obviously, him reuniting with Lysa and him revealing that he kind of like engineered this entire Stark-Lannister conflict that we followed throughout the first 3 seasons by having Lysa poison Jon Arryn and then write that letter, you know? And now he's showing his hand to Sansa by revealing both his feelings for her that have kind of carried over from Catelyn, and also like his dream of seeing them ruling together on the Iron Throne. Whether he actually means any sort of sincerity towards Sansa or not, that's kind of apropos of the point. But how that carries over into the next sequence as far as with him and Lysa is the fact that his decision to murder Lysa does not come from any sort of tactical advantage, right? It's kind of apropos of everything that he was saying to Sansa at the beginning of the season, where Sansa's questioning him and his motivations. It's like, the Lannisters, they gave you everything. They made you this position of power. Why would you backstab them? And Littlefinger's whole stance has always been, keep your enemies confused, because in this world where you yourself, you know, again, coming from this position of kind of low privilege and always seeing greater aspirations for him, in this world where nobody is going to really take him seriously, again, it's a great point of mockery. You know, his sigil is the Mockingbird. Mockingbird, literally, to the point where the other great older houses kind of look down on him. If anything, he's almost the Saul Goodman of Westeros in that sense, where he's like, yeah, in this world, everyone is your enemy, you know? But in this
talk about dream casting, you know, Bob Odenkirk as Littlefinger. Yeah, and Jennifer Lawrence as Marjorie. I think we already got two major casting changes that would have changed things for sure.
From the beginning joke, but it's really interesting because again he kills Lysa because both his use for her has kind of come to an end, where he realizes that if he keeps her alive, then he's just going to jeopardize some of his future plans. But also,
yeah, she's a liability.
She's a liability, right? But also, it's the fact that he's doing this because of his care for Sansa, you know, because she threatened Sansa. Like, he could have had her killed at any point. He could have poisoned her. He could have, like, casually, you know, he could have pushed her out the moon door at any point, but he chooses this specific moment to do it. And of course, before he does it, he does the one last FU of saying, I've only been in love with one person ever, your sister, before just the push. It's like twisting the knife before pushing it in further. And the last shot, just looking up at him, I think it's amazingly well done, where again, it's like kind of how he perfectly envisions himself, and just looking over everything is you just see the ominous shot of her falling. But I don't know, like, what's your take on that?
You know, my take is really that I kind of like the idea that this was a little spur of the moment, but I think because of the conversation,
uncharacteristic of him, because everything about Littlefinger has always been, again, seeing 10, 12 steps ahead of every character, you know?
I think it comes down to, like, during his conversation with Sansa and just like how she's handled herself since being here at the Eyrie, Littlefinger got a new idea. Like, what happens if I marry Lysa and then, you know, at this moment, I just throw her out the door. You know, it's right. I think it's one of those things where, you know, knowing from the next couple episodes, he puts his faith in Sansa. And yes. I think he takes a calculated risk. Right. And that's what he's all about. And I think it's like he saw this opportunity to better his position and eliminate a liability, and he went for it. Like, you know, it's like, he took a risk. Yeah, it's like big risk, big reward. Right. You know, but big risk, big punishment. So he decides to gamble.
Because as we come to see later on, obviously we know that, you know, the long term of him kind of putting his faith in Sansa in that moment, him actually trusting another person for something that was kind of a spur of the moment decision as opposed to something he calculated. This is not the same as him making the plan with Olenna to kill Joffrey, where the two of them, that was so planned out. It benefited them both ultimately, you know, as far as Olenna not having to have her granddaughter marry Joffrey, and Littlefinger kind of, you know, keeping his enemies confused in that sense. But this is kind of a spur of the moment decision. And as we see, regardless, like, I'll save the, you know, the Littlefinger, you know, kind of what happens afterwards as far as how Littlefinger kind of, you know, reacts to that decision in the books versus how he carries it out in the show. I'll save that for the later seasons. But we see, like, this moment right here in hindsight is the beginning of the end for him. And I think that's a great spot to leave off, because again, it's the first time that he's ever actually been forced to put his faith in another person for no other reason other than just the deliberation of the timing of events immediately in that setting, which is something that he's probably never had to do before in his entire life, and it's a thing that is going to come back and bite him in the ass. And with that being said, that is our review, our recap of Season 4, Episode 7, Mockingbird, another fantastic episode that is just setting us up for the next 3 episodes, which again, it's gangbusters after gangbusters after gangbusters. We've got 3 episodes left of this season. Still my favorite season of the whole show. Before we get into the very problematic Season 5, I want to thank you guys all once again for joining us for another episode. Like I said, these episodes are going to primarily remain on Spotify and Apple Podcasts going forward. We might put up a bonus episode on YouTube here and there, but keep tuning in for new episodes every Friday. Like I said, we're going all the way up until the finale. We're not stopping until then. Be sure to follow Professor Pat with everything he's got going on at Patrick W. Huber on Instagram. Follow myself at Movie Nerd Reviews across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Letterboxd, Serialized, TikTok. Fortunately, I am forced to join that platform. Of course, be sure to follow the @official Talkin TV podcast, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And as always, people, and of course, be sure to click the subscribe button on the YouTube channel. Be sure to click the like button and the subscribe button. And as always, remember, 12 seasons in a short film. And watch more movies.
More J-Law movies, man.
Oh, man. They may regret that. We'll see you guys next time.